What Now, America? With Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen. And now, Archbishop Sheen.
Fellow Americans, I want to begin by telling you a story about, something that the bishops wear formally. It is called a rochet, R-O-C-H-E-T. A rochet is linen down to the waist. And from the waist to the knees, it is linen, lace. So you have linen and lace. A short time ago, I stopped in the Hilton Hotel of Los Angeles. And when I went up to bed at night, I found my pajamas on one bed and the rochet on the other. No, I didn't explain that. Well, in this, another one of the series of What Now, America, our subject will be the phony infinite. It'll be about drugs. America has a new spirituality. A new mysticism. What is mysticism? Mysticism is a reaching and a searching for the divine. Now we have two new American methods of spirituality. They're not very sound, of course. One of them is alcohol. The other is drugs. And by alcohol, one tries to get out of this world. His worries, his anxieties. By drugs, one hopes to get into another world. We're going to discuss not alcohol, but drugs. Now, I'm going to give you the argument that is advanced by intellectuals, sometimes by a few psychiatrists, to justify the taking of drugs in any form whatsoever. Their basic argument is that drugs get you into another world. It's a higher form of mysticism. As one of the books recently issued stated, taking drugs is the way to the new politics. Because drugs gives you a new consciousness. And whenever you get a new consciousness, you get a new politics. Hence, a nation that takes drugs will become a new kind of political entity. And furthermore, they argue that drugs get you out of this world of space and time. It collapses. You're transcendent. You're taken into another kind of world. And those who have had some religious background do have indeed some religious experience, but it is only the rearrangement of their sensations and emotions. But the basic argument is that you no longer belong to time. Hence, drug addicts generally will go in for some of the Eastern religions. That's a very interesting phenomenon. The reason is the Eastern religions are pantheistic. Namely, God is in everything. Everything. God is in the forger and the forged. He's in the drunkard, he's in the alcoholic. And so by taking drugs, you get into a kind of cosmic consciousness. You feel one with the universe. Now we'll let them speak. I'm going to read you the testimony of 2 or 3 drug addicts who claim that drugs make you deeply spiritual. I'm going to read to you. Now, listen. When I read, I'm not like the cheaters. The cheaters who've got it all hidden, notice under a desk, news report, all of their talks, they look up to you, but they've got it all written down here. Or else they've got a teleprompter outside. You can always tell them when they have a teleprompter. It's like this. So when I read. I once heard an old woman say of a bishop who was reading a speech, he says, "Glory be to God, if he can't remember it, how does he expect us to?" So there are some things that are not worth getting into the head, and this is one of them. That's why I read it. This mystic, drug mystic, says, Christ must have been a gas. I think he was a very turned-on guy. God is the coolest thing of all. I think if I'm just a splinter out of his head, then he must be a bit like me. Not much, though. I see him as a monster sun that opens in the middle and you get sucked in and out on the other side. That's mysticism of the drug variety. Here's another heroin addict. This is a girl. Now, it doesn't make much sense, but this is the way she wrote it. As the clouds gathered together and prayed, drawing together their dark, thundering brows to meditate upon the sweeping sickness of a generation, and of thousands and thousands bent walking sticks, aids for the physical and the molting, a dream that started somewhere under the black, dripping, longing, listless evening, and the pillars of mist, rotting away as everyone else has done to the strains of the whining, careless love needle of death. Just pick up sometime St. John of the Cross or Teresa of Avila for real mysticism, and you see how phony this is. So I'm going to describe to you today, because our subject is the phony mysticism, the difference between true and false mysticism. So we'll start with this comparison. This is the phony mysticism, and this is the authentic mysticism. The phony mysticism deals only with the senses, images, emotions, phantasms, and the like. You see, we have 3 levels. One level is faith. The other level is reason, which is below it. And then the other, senses. Now, they eliminate the first 2. They have only senses. And hence they're very much concerned about, well, the way they feel. The authentic mysticism, on the other side, is concerned always with the intellect and with the will. An authentic mystic is always afraid of emotions. Just as soon as one begins saying, "Oh, I had visions," one suspects him. Do you know that I got a telegram once that read, "Report at once to Pier 53, New York for a revelation of the Holy Spirit"? Now that's phony mysticism. That's all feelings and emotions. But the authentic mystic starts with intellect. For example, "I am the truth." Not the person is, but the good Lord. "I am the truth." And he follows that truth. Then he resolves by an act of will to overcome that which is base. Take, for example, a drug addict that I had experienced once in London. He used to come into the church that I opened at St. Patrick's Square, Soho Square in London, every morning about 7 o'clock, and he would stay there until, 11, then go out for a couple of hours, then come back again. And to test him one day, I said, have you always been as good as you are now? Well, he said, considering, he said, what I've been through, I'm probably worse. What I've received, I'm probably worse than I ever was. Then he told me that he was an addict. And he said, I resolved to break with the addiction. And I went into a church near Covent Garden. Went up to the front and kneel, and there came over me an overwhelming passion for drugs. I couldn't stand it. And I ran up the aisle of the church. And there are 3 steps leading up to the street level. And I stumbled on those. And he said, I tore my heart out. I went through 1,000 crucifixions by that act of will. And from that day on to this, I've never touched it. He said, how many hours do you pray a day? I always said about 18. I said, what do you consider a good day? He said, 24. I live with the same drug addicts I always lived with. This is a different kind of mysticism. This involves, as you see, the will and not feelings. And because the emotions are involved, you get all crazy ideas. For example, one man looked at himself in the mirror, thought he saw Christ, and cut his neck and then cut his wrist. Another one thought he was the Messiah and refused to eat because he felt the Messiah shouldn't eat. Another one had a vision of 2,000 headlights coming into him and suffered a wreck. Archdiocese' daughter threw herself out of a window. Another boy thought he could fly, jumped off a cliff. Emotions, feelings, never reason, never the will. That's the first difference. And then a second difference is that this destroys health, the drugs. And this gives peace, inner peace and joy. Destroys health. Now here I'm going to limit myself only to the effects of LSD, not the more serious effects, just LSD. A mother in Oregon delivered a baby. She was a victim of LSD. The right side of the skull was far larger than the other. 5 young men just last week in New York City, all under 21, were sent to a mental institution for life. 3 young men in Los Angeles were found to have destroyed chromosomes in their body. If they had children, they would have all been suffering from the kind of leukemia that happened at Hiroshima after the dropping of the bomb. Another mother who took LSD had a baby who cried like a cat. Another young man who took it, he had convulsions that were so extreme that he broke 3 of his ribs. And this is called mysticism. Now contrast the other, peace. Take, for example, St. Francis of Assisi. He was a mystic. And there was a certain amount of self-discipline in his life. He had been giving away a great deal of money to the poor, in fact, giving away some of his father's bales of cotton. And the father became a bit disturbed about it and summoned Francis before the bishop. And young Francis said, "Up until now I have called you, Pietro Bernardoni, my father. From now on I shall call no one father but God." And he stripped off his robes, every one of them except a hair shirt, and then took the bag of gold and threw it on top of them and went out. Went out, and he seemed to see the word fool written across his path as he walked. He felt as silly as a fly on a window pane. But he would go on playing the court fool of the King of Paradise. And that man, with his mysticism, has influenced from that day on to this millions and millions of people who want to have his peace through his poverty and through his charity. Let me give you another classic example. You all know the Beatles. Here is a recent testimony of one of them, John Lennon. All the Beatles took dope. All of them. Lennon said, I used to become frightened sometimes when I was going to the studio. And he said, we'd take food and we'd throw it on the floor. And then speaking of the other Beatles, he said, I think George was pretty heavy on it. He was probably the most cracked. Paul is a bit more stable than George and I. And Ringo was profoundly shocked by the LSD. Now, what does John Lennon say? He says, I took at least 1,000 trips. Now listen to him. I'm sick of all these aggressive hippies, or whatever they are, of the now generation, being uptight with me, either on the street or anywhere else, or on the phone, demanding my attention as if I owed them something. All that business was awful. One has to so completely humiliate oneself to be what the Beatles were. And that's what I resent. I didn't know, I didn't foresee. It happened bit by bit, gradually, until this complete craziness is surrounding you. And you're doing exactly what you don't want to do with people you can't stand, the people you hated when you were 10. He got away from his phony mysticism. So life is made up of a choice. It's made up of a choice between what might be called the quick trip and the long haul. The quick trip, trying to become mystical by a shot in the arm. In other ways, the long haul. It takes a great deal of effort. Believe me, I've been trying all my life to develop a bit of spirituality inside of me, and it's not easy. It's hard. I wonder what's going to happen to our country and our civilization if this drug culture goes on. Dr. Sidney Cohen, who is a specialist in this, says that you could put enough dope in a 2-seater suitcase to completely paralyze all the citizens of the United States for one day. And you could pack enough in an overcoat pocket to wreck the mental processes of New York City. And an enemy could take it over, and the next day we would be found under new management. Are we developing a necropolis, a city of death? We want everything immediate. We want to get out of this world immediately. And so we're developing atomic bombs. That's another form of immediacy. And these two instantaneous things could make of us a city of death. So I choose this subject to let our young people know and America know that we are, from this aspect, degenerating. There's an answer. I'm going to tell you the story of a hippie, a drug addict. He was on opium, this man I'm going to tell you about. And he went from the false mysticism to the true. He knew both. He was Francis Thompson, born in Preston, England, about the middle of the last century. His father was a doctor. His mother at 17 gave him, imagine a mother doing this, gave him De Quincey's Confessions of an Opium Eater. So he decided to try some laudanum. He was studying for medicine, which he didn't care for. And he left home, went to London. Lived first in the Soho Square district, which I know so well because I've spent about 7 years of my life over different periods of time in that particular area. And there he met a bootmaker who befriended him for a time and tried to cure him of his dope. Gave him money, bought him new clothes, but he went back again to the streets. And finally he's up to 4 ounces of opium a day. He would make a little money running for carriages in the rain for theater goers, holding the reins of horses. And he would sleep at Covent Garden. That was the market area of London, which is now being taken down. And hundreds of 2 great wheel trucks would bring in the produce every morning that would feed London. And he would sleep under those trucks. And as he put it in one of his poems, suffered under the trampling hoof of every hour. You can imagine the pounding of the hoofs of the horses as he slept under the wagon. Trampled under the hoofs of every hour. And then again in an immortal line, looking at the stars, he said he endured the abashless inquisition of each star, as if they were asking the purpose of his life. He would spend a great deal of time in the Chelsea Guild, the Guild Library. Sometimes Sophocles in one pocket, Blake in another. One day, a prostitute picked him out of the gutter. And I do not believe that anyone has ever written of a prostitute the lines that Thompson wrote about this one who picked him up. He said she was a flower fallen from the budded coronal of spring and blown withering through the streets. And of her scant pittance did she give, that I might eat and live. And she fed him, took him to her home in Chelsea, and she knew he was not the ordinary run of men despite the way that he was dressed. She said, "You're a genius, and you must not become involved with me." And she walked out of his life, and he never saw her again. He searched through the streets of London just as De Quincey, the opium eater, searched for Anne, whom he met. But he never could find this girl. And it was she, her leaving, that wrought in his soul the beginnings of the greatest mystical poem that was ever written, The Hound of Heaven. So in this Hound of Heaven he describes God, the Hound of Heaven, true mysticism, pursuing him. He's running from him, as he said, I fled him down the nights and down the days. I fled him down the arches of the years. I fled him down the labyrinthine ways of my own mind. Up vistaed hopes I sprang, and shot, precipitated down titanic glooms of chasm fears from those strong feet that followed after, and with unhurrying chase, deliberate speed, majestic instancy they beat. And a voice above their beat, though all things betrayest thee, who betrayest me. And he found that he had to give up his opium and his life. Aided by the Manels, he completed this poem. And in the end, the hound of heaven catches up with him, and he becomes the authentic mystic. As the hound of heaven speaks and says, poor, piteous, futile thing. Why should any set thee love apart? Seeing none but I make much of naught, he said. And human love needs human meriting. And how hast thou merited? Of all man's clotted clay the dingiest clot. Alas, thou knowest not how little worthy of any love thou art. For whom shalt thou find to love ignoble thee? Save me. Save only me. All that thy child's mistakes, fancies as lost, I have stored for thee at home. Rise, clasp my hand, and come. This is the mysticism of an authentic man who overcame opium and dope when everyone else couldn't do it, for he's shadowed by the hound of heaven. Thank you. Bye, and God love you.